Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell. Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. If this is your first time listening, a very warm welcome. For this podcast, we're delighted to welcome back Whitney Johnson to discuss her latest book, Build an A-Team. Whitney is the author of the best-selling book, Disrupt Yourself, Putting the Power of Innovation to Work, and is the founder of the accompanying Disrupt Yourself podcast. She's also a noted speaker, an executive and innovation coach, and is a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review. Now, a central theme of Whitney's book is the application of principles, the S-curve, that she's successfully applied in the world of investing to the disciplines of leadership and development. And in investing, this is used to assess when a company is set for rapid growth and when this growth will flatten out. In applying this to the learning space, Whitney describes a period where we are taking on something new, where it can feel like our hard work is not delivering. That time before we gain competence, confidence, and performance improvement, before we subsequently gain mastery, and possibly risk boredom. Now, we discuss how for leaders a critical job is to recognize where their people are on the S-curve, and when they're on the top of the S-curve, helping them leap to the bottom of a new learning curve, thereby creating a positive loop of development and innovation. And in my conversation with Whitney, we look at examples of companies adopting this approach and the lessons that we as leaders can take back to our places of work. So, very pleased again to have Whitney back on the show. I hope you'll enjoy it.
Well, Whitney, great to have you back on the show after a 2-year pause. And now you've got a new book coming out called Build an A-Team. And when we last spoke a couple of years ago, you talked about your previous book, Disrupt Yourself. And what's common in these two books is this concept of the S-curve. So perhaps we could just start by explaining what the S-curve is.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that happened when I was investing with Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School is in this Disruptive Innovation Fund is that we use the S-curve to help us gauge how quickly an innovation would be adopted. And then by extension, when a stock was going to make sense to invest in or not. And so the S-curve at its simplest, think about in your mind, I want you to picture an S. I want you to picture a graph. And on the from left to right, or the x-axis, is time. And then from bottom to top on the y-axis is improvement or getting good at something, or in this particular instance, market share. And so at the bottom of the S, early on, growth is very, very slow. Once you reach a tipping point, which is typically 10 to 15% of the market, you enter hypergrowth. And then at 90% or saturation, growth tapers off. Now, the big aha that I had as we were investing is that this S-curve also applies to people. It's not just products and services and companies, but it's also people. And so every time you start something new, you start a new project, you start a new role, you start a new business, it's an opportunity to disrupt. And it helped me understand the psychology of disruption or the psychology of learning. And so at the bottom of the S, whenever you start this new project, the S-curve now tells you the growth is going to be really slow. You're working. It looks like nothing is happening. But what's happening is you're learning and you're building up momentum until you hit the knee of that curve and you go up to the straight, sleek, steep back of that curve, at which point you're feeling very competent. And with that comes confidence. And then at the top of the curve, it flattens out again, which you're doing, and nothing's happening. And that's because you've achieved mastery and you're starting to get a little bit bored. And so this is the S-curve of learning. And what I've done is I've taken that. And in the prior book, I talked about how you disrupt yourself, 7 steps to do that, giving people a structure for disrupting themselves. And in this book, I say, okay, now that you do it for yourself, how do you manage a team using these S-curves, and in particular, this S-curve of learning?
And I'm curious, do you remember the exact moment when you had this insight that you can apply what is essentially it's a product launch model and a market share growth model to people. I mean, in retrospect, it makes a huge amount of sense. But I guess, when you were running money for the Christensen Fund, it probably wasn't what you were expected to be doing. I'm just interested about why, what got you to apply a model from one discipline into another discipline?
It's such a good question, Mark. And I don't know for sure. I think sometimes, we like to think, I love your logo for Innovation Ecosystem, which is the light bulb and with all these really interesting connections. And I don't remember exactly when I had the light bulb moment, but I do know I can think of one particular moment when I was actually still working on Wall Street and I had just read The Innovator's Dilemma. So this is before I had even started to work with Clayton. And I read The Innovator's Dilemma and I remember having this aha at that point. I think at this point it was this kernel of an idea, which was I can continue to work on Wall Street and I can continue to be an equity analyst. But I think that if I want to accomplish some of my other goals that I have in life, I'm going to need to disrupt myself. And I think that's the kernel of all of this. And so that was the first time I thought this. And this was back in 2004, 2005. So 14 years ago now. And then I think your question around the S curve, because I already had this idea of it's not just products, it's not just services, it's people. As we started to apply the S curve for investing, I started thinking, well, if it's people too, then what does this look like for a person? And if you're at the low end of the curve, what does that look and feel like, et cetera?
Right. And then segueing in, because your new book starts with the WD story, which is, it's an extraordinary story. It's a 40-year-old product with 80% market share. It's avoided being commoditized. And, I know the CEO's been on one of your early podcasts, which I listened to again today. But the really interesting thing here is the HR strategy, which you describe as being built on learning and disruption, which is, as you say in the book, the most powerful way to foster innovation. So, what is the link between the S curve and a culture of learning, which it seems like is a characteristic of WD-40?
Yeah, so let me give you another image of think about this idea of, to lead into the story around WD-40, is that as a leader, as a manager, you've got this S and you lead people up that learning curve. And so they learn. And then when they get to the top of that learning curve, you make it possible for them to leap to the bottom of a new learning curve. So you learn, you leap, and you repeat. And when you do that, you've got a culture that can be innovative because as you're learning and you're taking on challenges and you're experiencing the friction that comes with those challenges, you're able to be innovative. And in the process, then you become a boss that people love and they want to work for, because who doesn't love a boss that gives them the opportunity to learn? And then when they learn what they need to learn, they get to try something new. So with that as a backdrop, let's talk about WD-40. As you just said, Mark, this is a company that makes a can of oil that stops squeaking. You're like, who even wants to work there, right? Get this call from a headhunter. Why am I going to work there? Well, apparently a lot of people want to work there because you've got 93% engagement versus 33% on average in the United States, and globally it's 15%. So I wanted to understand this. So I interviewed Gary Ridge, perfect company to test my hypothesis. And it turns out, based on the research and the diagnostics that we administered, as you said, they practice this learn, leap, repeat strategy. So this is a company where people, they are the strategy. How does that look? Well, they have an identifiable career path inside the company. It takes them not just from starting at point A and who knows where you're going to go, but you're going to start at point A and then you're going to go to B and then C and then D. They want people to stay in-house, not chained to a particular role. And so Gary Ridge said, we've got 3 senior people that started out as a receptionist and one is now the brand manager. And so it's no wonder, based on our research, that 60% of the people think, you know what, I can satisfy my career goals here. So again, people are challenged. When you're challenged, you stay, you're happy, you innovate, and innovative people disrupt. They don't get disrupted. And again, this isn't Google. It's not Silicon Valley. They make a can of oil. And so this goes back to my fundamental premise that if you want to disrupt, you start with the people in an organization. Let them climb that S curve, apply the constraints, make things a little squeaky in the process so they get the grease, and then your innovation is going to happen.
And incidentally, as you also, the CEO is happy to point out, the financial performance of the company has been pretty remarkable. I think 16%, CAGR year on year for, almost 2 decades. I'm curious, do you know, I know you've moved out of that world now, but are there analysts who specifically apply a different sort of set of criteria when they're analyzing companies? I mean, I just wonder what the link is between, if there's an explicit link between people strategy and financial performance. Are people doing any work in that? I just wondered if that was, because I mean, those are the two worlds, the world you've come from and the world you're in today. I just wondered if that rings true.
Right. It's a great question. And it's something that we're absolutely working on because I think it's fascinating is, can you build an index that looks at that? So that is something that we are currently looking at.
Interesting. As we get into the book, I mean, there's a couple of things that really struck me, which I'd love to explore. I mean, the S-curve that you talked about, I mean, you're talking essentially about a diverse group of people in a team or in an organization in terms of their diversity of experience up the learning curve. But if we look at diversity from a different angle, the kinds of people that companies are recruiting, and there are two groups that I've heard a little bit about, but perhaps it's not in mainstream yet, but the on-rampers and the boomerangs. So can you just talk a little bit about what companies are doing to recruit these kinds of people in, and what the value proposition of bringing in on-rampers and boomerangs, and maybe start by explaining what those two terms mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so again, let's go back to the theory of disruption. So your odds of success are 6 times higher when you pursue a disruptive course. And one of the first tenets of this is to play where no one else is playing, basically to take on market versus competitive risk. And so we oftentimes think of this in the context of launching a product, but it also, again, applies to people and it applies to hiring. And so when you take on competitive risk in hiring, you're going to be hiring Ivy League educated MBAs who've done the exact job you need them to do for the past 3 years. You're going to feel safe, but it's competitive risk because you might not be able to hire them. And even if you do, you're going to have a hard time keeping them. So why wouldn't you also take on market risk when you're hiring? If there's talent there, there's no competition. So 2 examples of this are boomerangers. Boomerangers are people who have worked for you, they've left, and now they want to come back. People used to not want to hire boomerangers. I personally think it's because they felt jilted. Like, you were my boyfriend and now you left and now I don't want you back. But why wouldn't you want someone you know you can work with who's gotten further training on someone else's dollar or euro or pound, whatever, and now they want to come back? I mean, that's a pretty great deal. And so one of the people that I interviewed for the book is, and you can listen to this podcast interview with Lee Carahurst. She's the founder of a PR and content marketing firm. She had an employee, Jenna Galloway Fowler, who was there for 2 years, senior account executive. She leaves to go to a fast growing startup, VC backed, super exciting. And then a year later, she comes back. She's got greater skills and greater empathy because she now understands what the client is thinking because she's been the client. So that's the boomeranger. The on-ramper is someone who's returning to the workforce after being out, usually to care for children or care for parents. And these employees are especially interesting because typically they're highly skilled in terms of technical skills or domain expertise, although they may need some brushing up. But they also have these competencies that the workforce desperately requires that they don't have. Things like persuasion, things like ability to be positive, even when people are not positive, and project management. And so there's this wonderful book by Ann Crittenden written, I don't know, probably 2 decades ago, who says, if you can raise children, you can do anything. So you've got this expert on the topic of on-rampers. Her name is Carol Fishman Cohen. She was citing her personal anecdote, not personal, primary research, I would say, in terms of she placed mid-career professionals in internships at MetLife. MetLife hired 11 out of the 12 people, so 92% of these interns within 3 months. I mean, how about that, right? How about that? So these non-traditional hires, these market risk hires, they're not picked over, they're not overpriced, and they're often really hungry with something to prove. And so there are lots of different ways to take this theory of disruption. Again, it's not just products, you can apply it to people. Fundamental unit of disruption is the individual. You get your people in a place where they're innovating, and you as an organization are going to be able to disrupt.
This strategy, is it, in your experience, limited to certain types of companies, or is it becoming widely embraced across the all the different sectors of the economy?
Well, I think smart companies is becoming widely embraced because they recognize, okay, if I am willing to do this, I'm going to get this really interesting talent at a bargain, right? And so I wouldn't say it's widely embraced, but I would say that the companies that do embrace it are the ones that are going to have an advantage.
Yeah. Now, I mean, of course, the challenge is when they get on board, I mean, there are sort of pressures, there's cultural elements that maybe will, as you say, they might become blinded by familiarity. In other words, I'm an anthropologist originally, they get sort of acculturalized. They get sort of, the different perspectives that they're bringing into the organization are very quickly eroded. So, I mean, how do companies stop that from happening? Because it's almost like when you buy a new car, right? The moment you drive it off the forecourt, you've lost 30% of the value. And I often wonder whether you're bringing a new person in with all these fresh perspectives, with this unique experience, and very quickly the organization, the culture of the organization overwhelms that, and they're left having to follow the standard cultural behaviors, if you like.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that you can do with us is, first of all, recognize that every single person's on a learning curve. They're only going to be at the low end of that learning curve for a period of time. Based on my analysis, it's going to be 6 months, maybe a year, but usually it's going to be 6 months. And so it's important during that period of time to have a check-in with them and say, what are you seeing? What are you seeing that we're doing? What could be done differently? And ask them specifically what they're seeing when they're, 2 to 3 months in. They've got a little bit of lay of the land, but not too much of the lay of the land. Now, let me tell you why people tend not to do that. Is because when someone comes in new, they're questioning the status quo. Why are you doing it like this? They're asking all those pesky little 3-year-old questions that you're like, can you just go back to your desk and do your work? That's not how we do it here. And so if you've got a process in place where you're willing to say, okay, 3 months in, I'm going to ask you. In fact, I expect you to sit down and evaluate for me what we're doing and what we could do differently. And it's part of that process. Then you're going to get that nugget of information from them before they get to the point where they are blind through familiarity.
Are there companies that you're aware of that are actually doing this?
I am in my company,
Okay.
and it certainly does make a difference. Toyota does it. Toyota
okay.
does it. Yeah.
So, but you do it yourselves. Can you give a sense of the kinds of things that are being uncovered in this 3-month conversation? I suppose the first thing is, how do you create that safe space for the conversation to happen? Because, as you say, after 3 months, if they're continuing to ask why, it takes quite a confident recruit to continue to challenge the status quo. So I'm just curious, can you give a sense of what sort of things come up in those conversations?
Yeah, and I would argue too, Mark, it takes a confident employer to ask those questions, right? Because they're effectively saying, well, the way you're doing it, there might be a better way. And that challenges your sense of identity. So the kinds of things that come up for me often are around process. So we've got a process of how we run the business. And then they say, well, what if you use this? Or what if you tried that? Or by the way, I mean, this just came up for me recently. By the way, although I had someone say to me, they didn't say it quite like this, I'm using it for effect, but although I really like to try to read minds, I'm not very good at it. So if you could be a little bit more explicit about what you need, that would be incredibly helpful. So it's that kind of thing of realizing that you need to do, at least for me, a better job of what's our process here, codifying processes, and then also being able to explain exactly what you want and need. And that's part of the reason why, again, people at the low end of the curve, they're asking pesky questions. And because they don't know what they're doing yet, you can get impatient really quickly. And part of the reason that you're getting impatient might be because you actually didn't explain what you needed and what the performance goals actually are.
Yeah. And I guess in a small sort of fast growing company, that's one, as the process is being put in place and constantly evolving. But I think there's also an example in the book, and I don't know whether it's from, can't remember where it's from, but you talk about this idea of gentle mobbing. Can you remember which company it was? Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. But
no, it's okay. So there was a company that they were like, it was a company they said to themselves, we need to really revitalize our sales force. So I'm going to bring in some new and hungry people that are going to have some great ideas. And basically, the more senior salespeople who could have learned from them and it could have improved their revenue growth and trajectory, they mobbed them out, and the people didn't survive because they just basically shut them out and sort of said, danger, danger, Will Robinson. We got to get rid of these people who are going to change things, because if they change things, it might make me irrelevant. So I got to get rid of them. And so that's what the gentle mobbing looks like. They didn't actually mob them, but they mobbed them psychologically.
Yes. Which, I mean, and these are, you refer to it in the book. I think I've seen the reference now. It wasn't quite like the Hunger Games, but it was almost like it. But I guess the reality is that these biases exist, the ways of doing things exist. And and clearly, in order to capture the value of which you articulated very clearly earlier on around bringing in people, with different experiences, be it the on-rampers or be it the boomerangs. It's important that the parent organization or the recipient organization is able to, I won't say absorb them, but certainly leverage their skills and preserve those unique perspectives for as long as possible. But as you say, it's also, this is probably quite cutting edge in the corporate world today anyway, I would imagine.
Well, what's interesting, actually, it's cutting edge. But what's fascinating is that if you are willing to do that, even with people who have been in your organization for a long time, because remember, if you're practicing this strategy of personal disruption, you're going to have a person who's potentially been at your company for 15 years, right? 20 years. And I interviewed Karen S. Carter, who's the Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at Dow. She's been there for 20, 25 years. Same company, continually disrupting herself. Every time you go to the bottom of a new learning curve, you are inexperienced again. Yes, you have domain expertise. Yes, you have, something, you've got skills, but you're still seeing things afresh. And so it's not just brand new recruits into the company. It's anybody who's jumping to a new learning curve.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the D&I, diversity and inclusion piece here, because I mean, again, coming back, a lot of this is around ensuring not only the individual, but the organization is remaining fresh and being open to fresh perspectives. And so the diversity in the broader sense of cognitive diversity is a constant theme throughout your new book, I guess. Do you see it that way, or am I missing something?
You're not missing something. You actually teased out something that was there embedded in the ethos of the book, but not something that I stated explicitly. But I think it's really interesting that you brought it up, that you're an anthropologist, you said, by training, and just thinking about this from the perspective of biology. Diversity is truly one of the, there are lots of studies out there that it's tough to be conclusive from a business perspective around the importance or the value of diversity. But biology tells you it is absolutely, it is one of the most powerful forces in nature. And, I won't go into all of it. Well, actually, I'm going to say really quickly, when you think about, our ancestors, they couldn't survive unless they adapted. And the way they adapted is you would have these genetic alterations in the DNA and replication. And then they're like, oh, we survived. And so then it would continue to get replicated. And you'd see this over and over and over again. And that's what ensured survival. What's fascinating to me is for an individual, every time you learn and you leap and you repeat, you are effectively iterating, and you're the next generation you, and you're slightly different. And so in biological terms, you're better poised for the next wave. And the same is true for your team. As you have this team of people who are at the low end, who are questioning.
What happens in nature is, and I'm not a biologist, but the adaptations are blind by nature, right? The agents aren't aware of the adaptation, but they're just happening through natural process, survival of the fittest. Whereas in the workplace, we as agents we can manage this process. We can actually leverage this incremental adaptation for our own goals, both at the individual level and also for the organizational level as well.
Absolutely. Bingo. And because we can manage it, we can make it happen more quickly.
Yes. Yeah. And so the whole concept of the ecosystem, which is, the other half of our business, I mean, the ability we know that ecosystems, monocultures, which are not diverse, ecosystems collapse very quickly, whereas diverse ecosystems have these buffers, these margins of safety, to use the financial investment language, which means that when they are hit by external shocks, they're able to survive. And I suppose that's the other piece of riding the S-curve, is that you're actually building in that level of resilience, I guess, from a career point of view, or indeed from a business point of view, if you're looking at it from a team perspective.
Exactly. And what's interesting, and what we found in our research, is that if you want to know if you as an organization are about to get disrupted, all you have to do is take the pulse of your workforce. Because if you've got too many people, the way you optimize for innovation is you've got 70% of your people in this sweet spot on that steep part, 15% at the low end, inexperienced, and 15% at the high end, the masters who can set the pace and have a vista and can see what's happening. But if you've got 40% of your people at the high end of that learning curve, they've become bored, and bored people leave, or bored people get complacent. And when you are complacent, you do not innovate. And so that's one of the best ways to manage your ecosystem for innovation, is to optimize where your people are on the learning curve.
You touched on this complacency. Now, when I heard that word, I was wondering, that's not a million miles away from entitlement, right?
No, it's not.
So let's pick up another big theme, which I just love to understand, which is, I think you said that 40% of the founders of Fortune 500 companies are included either an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. And I'm just really interested in this other piece to the story here around why is that? What is it about immigrants or people who are outsiders that have such a big impact on the makeup of, for instance, of corporate America?
Yeah. So entitlement is the belief that this is the way things should and will always be. And so if you think about it from a company perspective, and I'll bring it to the individual perspective, think about that S curve again. I talk about entitlement right when you're in the sweet spot. So your revenue's growing, your margin's expanding, and you're like, we are successful. And the more successful you are, the more you think you deserve your success. And yet, innovation only really happens when you don't know quite what you're doing and when you're in this place that's somewhat uncomfortable, where you don't like things the way you are. You've got this burr, you've got this itch. And so they're fundamentally at odds with one another. And so I think the first step in recognizing that as an organization is to just recognize that we're going to get entitled, and then recognize it as an individual that we're going to get entitled. You can be entitled because everything's working. You can be entitled when things aren't working and you think you deserve more than you have. The thing that's most important about entitlement is to know absolutely that we are all entitled. It's just a question of how. And when we're willing to be aware of that, that's the first step to being able to disrupt the current version of ourselves. And one more concrete way of doing that is to impose constraints to give yourself friction. So for example, if you're starting to get a little too comfortable, things are too easy at work, and this is where stretch assignments come in for individuals. You've got a person in the sweet spot. They're going to get complacent pretty quickly because they're easy, they're fun, they're having a great time. Impose constraints. For example, your revenue target for this year is X. Then tell them that you want your revenue target to be 1.5x. Or if their revenue target is X and you've got 12 months to do it, say, what would you do if you only had 9 months to do it? What would you do differently? And start imposing these constraints that force people to think, okay, how could I do it differently? Because that's how almost always people really actually innovate. And there's a great example. It's coming out of my podcast today, Patty McCord of Powerful. She was saying she was the CHRO at Netflix. They only really figured out their business model when they were about to go bankrupt. And it's the same for individuals. Oftentimes you will find that when people get fired or lose their job, it's that point at which they've been pushed off the learning curve that they start to get really innovative and resourceful about what they're going to do with the rest of their life. And so we all have entitlement. It's always there. Sometimes entitlement, we get pushed off the learning curve and it takes care of itself. Ideally, we'll recognize it when we're on the curve and we take care of it so that we don't have to be pushed off the curve. But we're still going to get pushed off because that's just the way life goes.
Yeah, or we actually proactively make a habit of disrupting ourselves. And when I say we, I actually mean you, because, that's like to make, just come off the book for a moment, because as I read the new book, what struck me was quite a lot of the content comes out of the podcasts, right? Quite a lot of the stories.
Exactly.
And I'm really curious, before I go to the questions that I sent to you in advance, I'm just curious about your journey, because we said at the beginning, we last spoke 2 years ago. You subsequently launched a very, very successful podcast. We're now talking again, and the podcast is resonating with me as I listen to it, but also it's being echoed in the book. And I just, what's the role of the podcast in your journey and your sort of your disruption, your ability to continue to disrupt? Because there's also videos that you're pushing out there. You've got an e-learning. I'm just really interested in how the portfolio is developing and where the podcast fits in.
What a great question. I have always loved to interview people. I've interviewed informally. Like if we were to sit down, I would ask you lots of questions. I just think, I know you're asking me questions, but this is not sort of what's most comfortable for me. I'd rather be asking you questions. And so I've always enjoyed it. I think it's fascinating to listen to someone and hear their story. And so it's something that I knew I wanted to do and ask people stories, but it took me a while to actually get started, because even though it seems like it's pretty easy to start a podcast, it's not, as you and I both know. But when I first started, I was very much the low end of the learning curve. I hired someone who had done radio for NPR to basically be my Sherpa in terms terms of how do you interview people? How do you set this up? How do you edit the podcast, et cetera? And so there was definitely a learning curve. And if you go back and listen to my early interviews versus my interviews now, I've improved vastly as an interviewer. And I'm sure you can relate. And so I think that there was this sense of I wanted to interview people. I wanted to have these interesting conversations. And then I found as I was having these interesting conversations and hearing all these really rich, detailed stories that they naturally just became a part of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I presume you're beginning to do a number of, be on the other side of the mic to promote the book. Is that fair? Or is most of your time interviewing other people at the moment?
That's absolutely fair. Yeah. In promoting the book, I am most grateful to people who are interested enough in my ideas to want to interview me like you. So okay. Thank you, Mark.
So my question, Whitney, is, and this is a difficult one, but I'll put you on the spot. What's different? Being on one side of the mic versus the other. Does anything, as in the moment here now, is there anything that's, that I'm just interested in the different perspectives here as someone who prepares for the interviews and asks the questions versus suddenly being on the other side of it. Just any things that strike you as this changing perspective?
The best way to describe it for me is that to take the hero's journey. And so when you're in your position, your job is to be the guide. You're the guide, you're asking the questions, you're bringing me through as the hero and the audience as the hero. And so that's a very different role to be the guide and sort of pull someone's story out of them and to put them in their best light. And then also in the process think, okay, what do my listeners need to hear and understand, et cetera. Whereas when I'm on this side of the mic, yes, it's a little bit of my job to be the guide, but also you're asking me to be the hero and to tell my story and what experience I've had and what I've learned. And so, yes, I need to toggle back into the guide area, but I think primarily or fundamentally they're different functions. You as the interviewer are the guide and me as the interviewee, I'm the hero. And so to toggle back and forth between those two roles, they're very different roles.
Yeah. And now that we've called it out, I'm certainly feeling very nervous about the final questions that I ask because I don't want to blow it at this point in the interview. But luckily, Whitney, these are the three questions I sent in advance, right? So the first one, what have you changed your mind about recently?
Yeah, so collaboration. I've never really liked to collaborate. I don't know if it's because I grew up playing piano, which classical piano, there wasn't a lot of collaboration. I played some tennis, which not necessarily collaboration because it was singles. It was thorny, complicated. And what caused me to change my mind, two things actually. I recently interviewed Peter Sims on my podcast, and he talked about collaboration and how at its core, generosity is at its core, and got me thinking about what good collaboration looks like. And then I've had this real-time experience of collaborating with a fellow by the name of Richie Norton on this course that we're developing called Unstuck. And the reason I've changed my mind is because going into that course, I would have been very, okay, what's our outline? What are we going to talk about? Be very organized, very structured. And Richie's approach was, let's show up. Let's talk. We've got these general ideas, and then we'll figure out what the course is after we've had the conversation. Very, very different than I would ever have done. And I was very, very anxious about it going into it. And yet, once we started, I was like, this is magic. This is amazing. This is fun. It's interesting. And so I think I've changed my mind about collaboration. If I can be willing to be generous when I'm collaborating and I can find another person who's willing to be generous. And I think there are breadcrumbs on the internet as to whether or not people are generous. There's this really wonderful opportunity to develop and grow and stretch and make discoveries and connections around ideas and thinking and people that I wouldn't be able to if I were working more in my own silo.
Mm. And when you say breadcrumbs, what specifically are you talking about? Can you give an example?
Oh, yeah. So I think that, there are people out there where like, oh, this person looks, they're awesome. I'd love to work with them. But you don't know if they're good to work with. One of the ways I think you can find out if people are good to work with is that you can find based on how they behave and what people say about them. You can damn people with faint praise. So what do people say about them? Are they a great collaborator? Are they great to work with? Have you learned a lot from them? And you can get a lot of information just throughout. Those are breadcrumbs to me. And they help you understand, okay, this person actually could be really good to potentially work with. I want to explore what that could look like.
Got it. Okay. And second question, Whitney, where do you go to get fresh perspectives to help you solve problems and make decisions?
I'm going to give you two answers. The first is I go to church every week. I think being able to go to church and be around people that I don't work with at all and be in this frame of mind of a more religious, devotional place, I get fresh perspectives. In fact, in this upcoming book, this example around the asphalt that I use, everybody go read it. By the way, you can download the first chapter if you go to whitneyjohnson.com/A-team. But this example of the asphalt, I got this because of someone who was teaching a lesson in church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have gotten that otherwise. And so that to me was really powerful. And the other way that I get new ideas is, you're going to laugh, when I commit to go do something, I show up to it.
Yeah.
For example, just a couple weeks ago, one of my friends, Liz Wiseman, who wrote the book Multipliers, had arranged for us to take a tour of the Tesla factory, right? Tesla. And I almost didn't go because I thought, oh, I've got to prepare my remarks for the next day. I've been on the road for a week and a half. I don't have time, blah, 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 blah. But I committed to go, and I'm really trying, if I make a commitment, to show up. Well, when I went, it was astonishing. It was like this plant, there were transformers. They looked like transformers, these robots that are building the cars. There was this stamping press that's like the several 747s who were stamping the panels of the machine. I felt this sense of awe, and I would call it almost religious awe of just this idea that had come from the mind of a human being, and now many human beings that are creating this beautiful machine. And after I came out of there, I was like, just think, if I hadn't gone, if I hadn't kept my word, all of these ideas, all of these thoughts, all of these learnings, none of them would have happened.
Yeah. And as you say, it's not good enough just to be there, but it's actually to be completely present and be 110% engaged in your surroundings and the conversations.
Exactly. And then the other thing I would add to that is just, there's so much around the future, and it's so dystopian, and things are going to be awful. And you go somewhere like that and you go, you know what? There's so much reason to be full of optimism and hope for the future when you see what people can create and build.
Yeah. We took a test drive in one the other day, actually, with my kids, because we were on holiday and they were offering a test drive. And it was I won't call it an out-of-body experience, but it was really a glimpse into the future, and it was, an amazing experience. But I could imagine that, having read about the factory that Musk built in his bio, it does sound like a remarkable place. That's the West Coast, isn't it? That's in LA, I guess.
Yeah. It's in Fremont, in California, in Silicon Valley.
I think I've driven past it when I was there a couple of years ago. Super. And then the final question, what's your most significant low? What have you learned from it, and how have you applied that learning, Whitney?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to say this is the most significant, but it was very significant for me anyway. So a few years ago, I bombed a speech, bombed it. And it was financial services, private equity firm. I was like, these are my people. They're going to love it. But when the speech was over, they didn't like it. They hated it. They got these comment cards to prove it. Like, there were some technical issues that threw me, but they said I was mechanical. I was dialing it in. Like, it was terrible. And the reason that it was so important is that it was so bad. It wasn't just kind of bad off day. It stunk so much that instead of just saying, okay, I've got to tweak this, I've got to improve it, I thought I have to change what I am doing. Now, what's interesting for me as I analyze that situation is the content itself, it didn't actually change that much, but my delivery did, like, significantly. So I stopped being the hero and I started being the guide, because when you're on stage, the audience is the hero. You, the speaker, are the guide. And the second thing I started doing, and this is from one of my mentors, Marshall Goldsmith, is I started having fun. Like, no matter what, when I'm on stage, I'm going to have fun. And that was a really important shift. It's not so serious. It's time to have fun. And up until that time, when I bombed it, so this is the idea of personal disruption. You have to step back to move forward. My speeches were good. I was getting kind of middle of the pack ratings. And now consistently, I'm among the top rated speakers. So that was a really important, significant failure for me, because speaking is a big part of what I do.
Yeah. And are you still able, I presume you are, seeing as you say you show up, but are you still able to have fun in this part of your business?
Yeah, now I'm starting to have fun. So it made a big difference. But and every once in a while, people say something to you. Like Marshall Goldsmith said this to me, like in 20 seconds. He probably doesn't even remember that he said it. He's just like, you should just have more fun when you're on stage. Just have a good time. And if you ever seen him speak, you'll understand exactly what he means. He has fun. He's silly and he gives serious content, but he's willing to make fun of himself and have fun with the audience.
Yeah, I saw him speak about 20 years ago and he was wonderful. He really was. Yeah, super. Whitney, as always, a great pleasure. You mentioned your website, but anywhere else that people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, so a couple things. They can obviously email me at wj@whitneyjohnson.com. Like I said, if you're interested, you can download the first chapter of Build an A-Team if you go to whitneyjohnson.com/A-Team. And if you're interested, you can also download the S-curve locator and see where you are on your current learning curve. And that you would just do /diagnostic. So I think those three things are a great starting place to be able to connect offline.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put all of those, as always, in the show notes. And, best of luck with the new book. Is it on the shelves yet, or is it pre-order?
It's pre-order until the launch date is May 1st, 2018.
Wonderful. Thank you again. I mean, it's great to have you back on the show after a 2-year respite. I continue to enjoy your podcast, and let's keep in touch. And I'm sure that one of these days, we'll meet face to face.
Thank you. It's been really fun.
Hi, it's Mark again. And what I found particularly valuable about my conversation with Whitney was the application of the core message to us as leaders and to our organizations. And we are all, of course, somewhere on a learning curve. And it's our job as individuals to make sure that we're exposing ourselves to new things to ensure our continued growth. And for our organizations, we can optimize the ecosystem for innovation by managing the mix of the makeup of our employee population. And Whitney's research described an ideal 15% low end, 70% sweet spot, 15% masters combination in terms of where the population is on the S-curve. And we also heard what consistently high-performing organizations like WD-40 do to foster innovation by actively managing their people's progression through learning curves. And in addition, we talked about a subject I've also covered recently with Franz Johansson, the importance of new employee onboarding processes, a time when so much can be learned by an organization from a group that has a fresh set of perspectives. And Whitney talks specifically about the value of on-rampers, those returning to the workforce after a break, and boomerangs, those returning to an organization for a second stint. These are groups that dramatically reduce the risk associated with hiring. And Whitney's a good friend to the innovation ecosystem, and I'm sure you will know by now why I was so pleased to have her back on the show. So once more, I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is Mark Bidwell. Please do check out our website, www.innovationecosystem.com. Let us know how you think we're doing, and if you've got any recommendations for guests, really interested to know that. And just drop us a note, mark@innovationecosystem.com. And without further ado, I'll let you get on with your lives. This is Mark Bidwell, changing perspectives, one podcast at a time.